everyone to the WomenNC and North Carolina CASA's lunch forum on sexual assault prevention, abuse, and awareness. My name is Joy Cook. I'm founder and president of Joy Cook Public Relations Group. And today I'm serving in a proud role as the board of directors member for WomenNC, and I will be your moderator today. We have a panel of experts on the topic of sexual assault and awareness as we commemorate Sexual Assault and Awareness Month. A topic that we don't just need to talk about today, but each and every day of the year. It impacts all of us, and all of us need to be more aware of how to prevent, as well as figure out ways to comfort and acknowledge those who have been impacted. I welcome everyone on Facebook. Today we'll be taking questions via Facebook as well as via Google form. In the chat, you'll see a link. You simply click on that link. The link will take you to a question box. All you have to do is type in your question, and during the Q&A part of today's event, we will be answering those questions. It is with great pleasure that I actually am able to introduce our panelists. And again, I'm Joy Cook. I'll be serving as your moderator as we go through this important day. First up, we have Leah Tugwell Poole. Leah is a rural sexual assault services specialist at the North Carolina Coalition for Sexual Assault. Leah also holds a master's degree in social work, as well as spent most of her academic career investigating the impact of sexual violence on college campuses, as well as conducting her own research on improving access to confidential reporting sources on campus. While Leah was in graduate school, she also worked at the campus's Women's Center, providing direct services to students impacted by sexual violence, as well as served as a campus peer educator. Prior to coming to NCCASA, Leah worked as an advocate with survivors at a dual domestic violence rape crisis program, as well as overseeing the training of a helpline that helped assist advocates in rural communities, as well as helped urban programs to improve their outreach and services to rural survivors in their service area. Leah has a strong lens when it comes to medical advocacy, as well as housing support for survivors. Thank you so much, Leah, for joining us, and we are so happy to have you. Next, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Daisy Schoen. Daisy is using the pronouns they, them, and is an advocate who's here in Greensboro, North Carolina. They, them are utilizing advocating for against interpersonal violence and for racial equity and food sovereignty. They work for Family Services of the Piedmont, UNCG, and the Guilford Urban Farming Initiative. They are a proud member of North Carolina Coalition of Sexual Assault. They give gratitude to the activists and change makers who came before them, without whom their work would not be possible. One of Daisy's greatest joys is participating in the witnessing of transformation of harm in communities. They can be reached at middlewaydaisy@gmail.com. Thank you so much for being here, Daisy. And our last guest speaker from North Carolina State University, Priyanka is a senior And she's majoring in economics with minors in international studies, as well as women's studies and global health. She's on the leadership board at NCSU Movement. Priyanka has been on the movement leadership team for the past 3 years and has participated in the organization's growth and evolution. The movement aims to end interpersonal violence on North Carolina State's campus through peer advocacy and education. And welcome, welcome, welcome to all 3 of our powerful panelists. We are broadcasting live on Facebook via the North Carolina, WomenNC's page, as well as NCCASA. You can stream there also if you would like. In the next hour, we hope to talk a little bit more about sexual abuse awareness, what the relevant laws are in the state of North Carolina, as well as how to support survivors of sexual assault. We'll also be coming up with and distributing resources that are available to survivors. And we also can talk about how we can reduce the incidence of sexual assault. And I'm so excited to pass it over to our first critical conversation of 2. We're going to have 2 parts here. And our first critical conversation, of course, is today. Our next critical conversation is going to take place on April 22nd at noon, and we're going to be talking about human trafficking. Again, please don't hesitate to ask questions in the Facebook chat as well as in the Google Doc. I want you all to make sure that you ask this powerful panel, and you'll also see here pictured Maria Ryman. She is the executive director of WomenNC, and I'd just like to thank her and our chair, Wendy, for this opportunity. Our first speaker, Leah, I'm going to actually pass everything over to you. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Joy, and I'm really excited to be here. Like Joy said, my name is Leah Poole. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Rural Sexual Assault Services Specialist at the North Carolina Coalition Against Sexual Assault, or NCCASA for short. During my time today, I'm going to talk about who NCCASA is and what we do. I'll give a brief overview of what is sexual violence. I'll talk about the reasons sexual violence continues to occur. I'll touch on some relevant laws related to sexual violence in North Carolina, as well as North Carolina specific statistics of sexual violence. I'll give some insights into what we've seen as far as sexual violence during COVID goes, and finish up by talking about sexual violence in reporting and how to support survivors. Please feel free to ask any questions along the way, and I'll take some pauses to answer any questions that come in. I know there's a lot of information here, so I'll just jump right in. NCCASA is an inclusive statewide alliance working to end sexual violence through education, advocacy, and legislation. Some of the things that NCCASA does are organize and sponsor statewide trainings about sexual violence, support rape crisis centers, provide technical assistance and resource sharing, local and national legislative advocacy and policy change, anti-human trafficking outreach, prevention education, and campus work. I'm going to start with just an overview of sexual violence, and we could spend this whole hour just talking about that. So this will be pretty brief, but I'll start with a basic definition. So sexual violence is any unwanted sexual contact that happens without free and clear consent. The most common depiction of sexual violence that we see is rape or sex without consent. However, it's important to remember that it also includes sexual coercion, so forced or manipulated consent, or sex with someone who is incapacitated or otherwise unable to consent. You'll notice that I refer to sexual violence as any unwanted sexual contact and not physical contact, because sexual violence can occur without physically touching someone. If you consensually share nude or sexual photos with someone and then they send them to other people without your consent, that is also a form of sexual violence. So I'm going to pause here if there's any questions so far, or any of the other panelists want to jump in.
Feel free to go ahead, Leah. We don't have any questions at the moment. However, you already have given a lot of great information. So panelists, do you have any questions that you'd like to pose to Leah or piggyback on anything she said? Okay, awesome. So one of the things when you think about this month, and then sexual assault awareness day being April 30th. What is it that you can tell our viewers? Why is this just so important, especially now that COVID has just rocked our world? Have you seen differences in how the assaults are reported, or lack of reporting, or is there a trend towards increase? Could you talk to us a little bit about that?
Sure. So as far as sexual assault during COVID goes, what I think is really important that people, so I guess I'll start with, in the news during COVID, we've seen and heard so much about the impact of COVID on people who are experiencing domestic violence and who are home with their partners. But the same is true for people who are experiencing sexual violence. Intimate partner sexual violence is one of the most common types of sexual violence. Most people who do experience any type of sexual violence experience that from a family member or from an intimate partner. So because we're still in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, we don't currently have any definitive statistics on the impact of COVID on sexual violence. And we believe we will know more over the next 5 to 10 years, which I kind of touch on why that's the case in a little bit. But as far as trends go, from hearing from rape crisis center advocates, what we've noticed is that survivors are seeking less services during the pandemic. And I know Daisy is here from a local rape crisis center, so I'm sure they will talk more about that. But I can just quickly say that so there's a few reasons why we think that this is. One is that a lot of survivors may not have known that supports have been available during the pandemic, particularly in the early months of 2020, because a lot of businesses were closed or only offering virtual or telephonic services, while they adjusted their service delivery to meet the needs of survivors and keep their own staff safe. So while none of our rape crisis centers closed, they did have to restructure. And I think that definitely had an impact on people kind of knowing, well, if I can't walk in, like, what can I do? Do they have the phone number to the hotline? Like, what does that look like? So then another thing is that a lot of survivors are connected to resources through accessing healthcare. Of course, a lot of people, well, actually less than you would think, but people do tend to go to the hospital or get a rape kit after they've experienced sexual assault. And so during COVID, going to the hospital definitely has felt even less safe. And in some areas, the hospitals may have been at capacity. There were a lot of barriers there. And so since healthcare is a huge kind of access point for survivors, the healthcare system was so heavily impacted that definitely affected survivors reaching out through those avenues. But outside of that, even going to the doctor, most survivors actually choose not to get a rape kit. But it doesn't mean that they're not accessing healthcare in other ways. And so that also would have been impacted. And then finally, like I mentioned before, many people who experience sexual violence are being harmed by an intimate partner or a family member. So usually someone that they live with. And so since a lot of people were working from home or lost their jobs and have been at home more, people experiencing sexual violence from someone in their home may have had less opportunity to get away or seek services without them knowing.
Awesome, awesome. And to all of our viewers, this is a safe space. If you'd like to ask a question where no one sees what you're asking, please do ask it via the Google Doc. Just click on it, ask your question, and we'll be able to even ask your question anonymously. You mentioned that in the time of COVID, victims didn't feel as comfortable because they were at home sometimes with their abusers. Would you give our viewers right now some type of access point, contact number? Where can, if someone's watching today and needs help, where can they go?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we have rape crisis centers in almost every county throughout the state. And so that's going to be, the best place for you to access resources is going to be at your local rape crisis center. So if you don't know which program that is, you can use NCCASA's website. We have a Get Help tool, and you can go on there and look for your county, and it will tell you what your program is and give you their crisis line number, hotline number, and address, and things like that. You can also contact the National Sexual Assault Hotline, or RAIN. And I will look for that number. I don't know it off the top of my head, but RAIN will also connect you to a local program most of the time. So that number is 1-800-656-4673.
Would you repeat that just one more time? You guys can go to NCCASA, is it .org?
Mm-hmm, yep.
Yes, NCCASA.org, and get help immediately, as well as the number that Leah's about to give us now.
1-800-656-4673.
Awesome. Thank you so very much, Leah. Really appreciate that. And it was so resourceful. And even for me, someone who considers themselves an advocate, it's always just a little bit uncomfortable, because we all know someone, if not ourselves, who have been impacted by sexual assault. And so this space is just such a vital and safe space. So thank you for giving those access points to getting help. And I'm going to bring Daisy into the conversation now. If you would tell us a little bit more, or tell us some things, Daisy, about what you've been seeing on the ground since the pandemic started. What is happening at your agency as far as trends?
Yeah, of course. I think that Leah touched on a lot of the trends that we had been seeing and are seeing now, right? Folks at the beginning of the pandemic, where we did stay open. My colleagues and I were working throughout the pandemic, but some folks were home, with perhaps like medical issues that kept them at home at that time. We have all transitioned back to being in person, and we see, I would say, a regular amount of clients at this time. However, when I was preparing for this meeting today and thinking about how have the clients I interact with generally been affected by COVID, I really was thinking about how trauma compounds, right? And hardly the first to say that the pandemic has been a source of collective trauma for our society, right? Even now, as folks are getting vaccinated and my colleague and I can be in our office without masks on, it's almost kind of terrifying to think, oh, am I being disrespectful to her, right, by not having that on? Just from that level to having folks who have lost loved ones, myself included, from COVID, there's a trauma that is collective for us there. And then to add on to that trauma of interpersonal violence occurring, it's like there's not two boxes that people live in where they're navigating COVID and job loss, psychological trauma from a pandemic, and then over here they're navigating survivorship. Like, it is all one messy box that folks navigate, right? And an example of that also came to mind was, I had a client who was doing a job interview while we were meeting, right? And she had brought her laptop and she said, I'm so sorry, but I have to do this job interview. I've been without work, and this is the day that I need to do my interview. And it's the day that I'm at my breaking point and I need advocacy. So really sitting with folks and honoring that, as survivors always have been, we are whole people. right? We have complex lives, complex identities, be that, survivors during the summer of reckoning, assessing racial trauma, pandemic trauma, interpersonal violence. It's like, it can feel overwhelming when you start to connect all of those dots. But something I've been encouraged by is that, support for survivors in a lot of ways looks similar to how it did pre-pandemic, right? We're just sort of more aware of needs. And by that, I mean material needs, right? Like survivors, when they come in, a lot of times they say, oh, I'd love to go to the hospital, but I have to pick up my kid from daycare. So I'm not going to take him to the hospital right now when there's a pandemic going on. You're like, okay, we talk about exams and whatnot, but really this person needs childcare. This is a pressing need for this human being. Or, I'll speak to, I'm a part of the Guilford Urban Farming Initiative. It is a food sovereignty organization that I'll be transparent, my partner has started. So that's a big part of their work. And folks come in and say, I haven't eaten in 2 days. Like that has happened. A survivor has come in and says, I had not eaten in 2 days. Right. And that was also the case before the pandemic, right? Folks have material needs that must be met as well as trauma that must be met. But I think the pandemic has both exacerbated those needs, right? With poverty, or more folks living in poverty during pandemic and post-pandemic, if we can say that, than before. And also, I think we're more aware of it collectively, right? As it hits more of us. So anyway, that is what we are seeing on the ground. I will speak to, Leah mentioned, folks might have hesitancies around healthcare access. That is a theme that we've really seen a lot of, is like, with a SANE exam, depending on the county that you're in and how many SANE nurses are available, you might be waiting 2 or 3, maybe more hours for them to be able to travel to you and perform an exam, right? So
Could I just interrupt you for a second, Daisy? Tell us what SANE nurses are.
Of course, my apologies. So SANE is an acronym. It stands for Sexual Assault Nurse Examiner. So when a person presents to a major hospital and requests a rape kit, an evidentiary exam, a forensic exam, these are all terms that are used, it is performed by a specific person called a sexual assault nurse examiner, a SANE nurse. And it must be performed by that specialized nurse. It cannot be performed just by any nurse in the facility or doctor in the facility. Yeah.
Actually, Daisy, if I could jump in, any nurse actually can perform a sexual assault exam. It's just preferred that a sexual assault nurse examiner with that special training does the exam, because they have the training, they know what they're looking for in terms of physical trauma, and also, other common injuries that occur when someone is sexually assaulted, and they tend to be more desirable on like a witness stand as an expert witness if the case were to go to trial. So a SANE nurse is definitely preferred. It's what we want, but a sexual assault kit can be performed by a nurse with the support of a physician.
Gotcha. Thank you so much for clarifying that. That's really good to know in general.
That's awesome. And thank you, Maria, for having Daisy identify what a SANE nurse was, because it's an education for me as well as for our general public. And it's great to know, Leah, that you can also be examined by a regular nurse. That alone makes this whole entire lunch and learn worth it. If you do have any questions, I just want to remind you, don't hesitate to utilize the Google link, drop your question there, or either live on Facebook. I do know that, is it NCCASA's Instagram? That's okay, awesome. So it's on Instagram. We are on Instagram live as well, and I'm excited about it. Thank you so much, Daisy, for speaking on the impact of the pandemic at your agency. Similarly to what I asked Leah, you gave an example about the food disparity and deficiency. If there was someone who was impacted or who was in need, want to take this time to make sure that we have an access point there as well. Could you give us a number or an access point for our viewers there?
Yeah, it's probably going to be different for what county they're in, right? Like the food access is a little bit different. If you are in Guilford County, I know that the Guilford Urban Ministry, again, I'll say it, Guilford Urban Ministry, does a lot of work specifically with the family services of the Piedmont to provide food for our clients.
And what was the market that you mentioned? The Greensboro Market? Okay, yeah. Would you tell us just a little bit about that?
Yeah, the Guilford Urban Farming Initiative, they call themselves.
Okay.
Yeah, so they are working to increase food access in areas of Greensboro that are classified as food deserts. And they're doing this in a variety of ways, but we also do have a focus on populations which have more interpersonal violence. It tend to be populations that are in poverty, right?
And so if you're not in Guilford County and you're under the sound of my voice, I want to encourage you to go to the NCCASA website and utilize that form. And when you are getting help, if anything you need, please let it be known. Again, questions in the chat, you can utilize the number that Leah gave us as well to report instances of sexual abuse, but also if you need other resources, the person may not be the person to be able to help you, but I'm sure they will be able to patch you in and connect you with someone who will. You mentioned the collective and you talked about pain, suffering wasn't in silos, that it was stacked on top of each other. Could you just give us a little bit about how you're seeing people cope? Do you see that maybe people have not recently experienced sexual assault, but let's just say 10 years ago, but the pain and trauma of being in the pandemic may have brought that out, or may have they decided through sitting with themselves. You know, sometimes when we're busy, we don't get to stop and think, but stopping and thinking during the pandemic may have given someone the courage to report their sexual assault. Have you seen any instances of that, just in general speaking?
That's insightful. I actually hadn't connected that myself until now. I can't say specifically that someone has, shared that exact scenario. I do know, however, that most clients who we see, whether they are presenting for, what we would statistically say is just domestic violence, have experienced some form of sexual violence in their lifetimes. We know that, again, people's lives are not just different boxes, right? Things are typically all mixed up, in lovely ways for their lives. So I will say most clients who I've seen will either disclose co-occurring, is what we call that, domestic violence and sexual violence, or specifically sexual violence in their past, be that as a child or past as an adult. It's an extremely, extremely common thing for our clients to disclose, whether or not it's the reason that they are there that day. Yeah, it's
Awesome. Thank you so much for clarifying and allowing me to make, that connection. And we want to go ahead over to Priyanka. If there are any questions from our panelists to Daisy, feel free to jump in, unmute yourselves and ask them. If not, we'll go ahead and move on to Priyanka briefly. Priyanka, would you tell us what the movement does and how it helps survivors?
Yeah, hi. My name is Priyanka and my pronouns are she, her, hers. So I'm on the leadership team of the movement. So the movement is a student-led interpersonal violence prevention organization from NC State's Women's Center. So what that means is that we do a lot of work surrounding educating our other students on campus on topics such as consent, bystander behavior, and supporting survivors. So we do this through outreach events with collaborations with other institutions on campus, such as student athletics, and as well as through workshops to different student groups. So whether that's residence halls or fraternities or sororities, we hold different trainings where we really engage in really important dialogue to let people know more about topics like, what does consent look like? What does a healthy relationship look like? How can you support a survivor? And you can also learn more about the resources we have by going to go.ncsu.edu/support survivors. So a lot of the work we do really focuses on shifting our culture on campus away from one that normalizes these really harmful behaviors and works towards creating a culture of consent and creating a culture that completely and wholeheartedly supports survivors.
Awesome, awesome, awesome. I love the fact that on college campuses, students have the access. Would you also tell us a little bit about why the work you do is important to prevention and education, bystander, and consent? And also, are there any observations or statistics that you can give us about sexual assault on college campuses?
Yeah, so this is going to be a lot of information, but like I said, one of the main aims of our group is really to have that culture shift on campus. So we really aim to start dialogue on campus to have a safer campus and community. So what this means is really talking to people about topics that maybe they haven't heard before. So talking to them about, what does consent look like? Like, it should be mutual and enthusiastic. If there's coercion, it's not consent. Having conversations about the fact that, we're brought up seeing this really romanticized version of stalking, and, that's actually not romantic. That's really problematic and harmful. So that's what a lot of our work and our dialogue and our conversations on campus look like. And it's really important because I think, unfortunately, growing up, a lot of people don't really have space to have these conversations and never really receive this information. So they don't really know what consent looks like, or how to support a survivor, or what a healthy relationship looks like. So a lot of what we want to do is to educate as many people as possible to really grasp this information and to spread it to the people around them. So when we talk about a culture shift, I don't know if everyone's aware of this, but if everyone's seen the rape culture pyramid, it talks about how sexual assault is kind of at the top of the pyramid, but there's all these really normalized behaviors at the bottom of the pyramid that really contribute to perpetuating these really harmful behaviors. So a lot of these behaviors are things like minimizing the severity of sexual assault, making jokes about it, objectifying people, and saying all these really harmful statements under the disguise of locker room talk. And unfortunately, on our college campus, those are things that we see more often than we should. We shouldn't be seeing them at all. So a lot of the work we do is really getting people to understand how harmful this is and how severe sexual assault is and how much more seriously we should be taking it. And I think for a lot of us, we see all these things in the media all the time, and it's really important for us to be active bystanders and to be able to call in those around us and to really educate people around us and let them know that, none of this is okay, and we can't stand for it to being normalized. So that's a lot of what we do through our end as student advocates that really want to change the campus around us. As far as sexual assault on our college campus, it isn't something I can speak a lot about because a lot of the work we do primarily surrounds advocacy and education. But I did speak to one of our wonderful survivor advocates at the Women's Center, Janine, who I think is on this live. And she gave me a lot of really good information about the trends ever since COVID started. So we generally have walk-in services at our college's Women's Center, I think similar to a lot of other colleges across North Carolina. But because of the pandemic, unfortunately, those aren't available. And most of the work that's being done is still available, but it's online. So there's been a really large increase in helpline emails and calls ever since the pandemic started. And I think something else to note that has definitely been a shift is there's been a drop in sexual assault reports, but a pretty big increase in reports of dating violence and domestic violence. And I think a lot of that can probably be attributed to the social isolation that a lot of survivors are facing right now. just because of quarantine and the way it's really displaced a lot of our lives. And I think another really big increase in terms of interpersonal violence through COVID is online risks. So we've also seen like an increase in terms of online stalking and online dating and the dangers that come along with that. And in addition to that, with other survivors, I think this was mentioned a couple of times by Leah and Daisy, but I think the mental health effects of the pandemic for survivors in terms of generalized anxiety increased trauma, and increased, just PTSD in general has definitely been something that we've seen, as well as I think the financial instability. I know, Daisy, you touched on this a lot, but even for college students, a lot of which had to lose jobs ever since the pandemic started, we've seen a really big increase in needs for the Survivor Fund, which is a fund that we provide on campus to survivors of sexual assault or any other interpersonal violence. And we've definitely seen a huge, huge increase in demands for that ever since COVID started and the pandemic started.
That was going to be my follow-up question, is on campus, have you seen an increased need for support services since COVID increased?
Yes, we have definitely. If people also want to donate to the Survivor Fund, you can definitely go to the link that I mentioned earlier before. And there's definitely been a much more.
And would you give us that link again, please?
Yes, of course. Okay. So it's go.ncsu.edu/support survivors.
Awesome.
Can I jump in, Joy, and ask a question?
Sure, absolutely. Please do.
I'd love to know from Leah and Daisy, and it seems to me one of the things that Priyanka has told us about is the importance of educating to prevent a lot of this violence. And it's my understanding that NCCASA does a lot of work on training and education, and I'm sure at the grassroots level, Daisy and her group are also involved in that. I wonder if you two could speak to some of those education initiatives for those of us who are not affiliated with a college campus.
Yeah, absolutely. So NCCASA does have a prevention education specialist, and that's not my role. So I can't speak specifically to all the things that Chris does, although Chris is amazing and just like does all the things wonderfully. And one of the things that Chris has done is our statewide Sexual Assault Awareness Month theme is Let's Talk About It. And so I can share more information. I can share the link to that. But the purpose of the Let's Talk About It campaign is to raise awareness about like online safety and being safe online as far as sexual violence and consent goes. So one of the things that we have, if you go to our Let's Talk About It page on our website, is videos that shows friends kind of doing an example of peer-to-peer consent and what that looks like. And we also have videos of a parent engaging with a child, talking about digital consent and talking about things, like, and I think sometimes when we talk about consent, people feel like it's this awkward thing, and it really doesn't have to be, and it's not. And, it totally depends on the language that you use. So just kind of, rather than saying like, oh, was that consensual? It's like someone may not understand exactly what that means, but saying like, oh, did that make you feel uncomfortable is like a better way to go about that conversation, especially I think when you're talking to a young person who like may not understand consent at this point. So that's kind of all part of our Let's Talk About It campaign right now is online and digital consent. But then some other things, we work with the Rape Prevention Education Program in the state of North Carolina, and work specifically with the sub-recipients of the RPE grant. And so we work a lot with the different rape crisis centers across the state that are doing prevention work as well in their own communities.
Thank you, Leah, so much for that. Yeah, another huge shout out to NCCASA. I know that their website is a wealth of knowledge if you are looking for like prevention, education resources, links to them and videos and all that. That's something that I turn to as well to stay educated in the field. I know that in my community in Guilford County, we do have an outreach team at the Family Services of the Piedmont. They do outreach with businesses, with the public library. I know they're partnering with the public library this month for Sexual Assault Awareness Month and doing some webinars of their own. I'd also like to give a shout out, kind of along what I was saying earlier, that that like poverty prevention is violence prevention, you know, and
Yes.
I feel like when we're talking about sexual violence and interpersonal violence, it is unique. It does need specialists. It does need people who care specifically about this particular issue. And, you know, folks experience a myriad of oppressions often, you know, they're unique in their lives. Anyway, I could get on a soapbox. But yes, poverty prevention is violence prevention. So does that look like, you know, food advocacy, which is something that's obviously on my heart, you know, making sure that communities have access to healthy food and to food that is what they actually want to eat. You know, education resources, childcare feels like a really big one for families as well. So I would just encourage folks, if they want to get involved with prevention, to just look at how they can help in their communities generally. I also find that can be helpful for folks who are like, oh, I could never be an advocate. I could never hear someone's story. Or, you know, I find, you know, there's different types of people with their level with hearing someone's trauma. So while someone might not have the spoons to do that on a daily or volunteer basis, they might feel really excited about doing a community garden or helping someone learn English who's a new American, right? So connecting folks in that way and knowing that strong communities is what is going to help us combat violence. That's
And I appreciate you connecting those dots, Daisy. Strong community helps us combat violence. That's definitely a tweetable, something that we should really, really think about, because all of us can help build a stronger community and take personal responsibility for that. So thank you, Maria, for asking that question, because it really did spark an amazing conversation with Leah's points as well as Daisy's. We're now going to go to the time in our Lunch and Learn where we take some audience questions. We have Ava Smith, who is an intern at WomenNC, who's going to let us know what questions have come in. Over to you, Ava.
Yeah, definitely. So the first question that was asked on Facebook, it says, recently there was a case in the news in Minnesota that said the person could not be charged for raping a girl because she became intoxicated before they met. Does anybody have any insight on this?
Yeah, I can talk about that. So obviously that's Minnesota, that's not North Carolina, and every state kind of makes their own laws. But I think it's really a poignant question. So prior to the passing of Senate Bill 199, which was passed in 2019 with the hard work of our lobbyist, Sky David, as well as the other legislators who supported that bill. So we're really grateful for that. In North Carolina, there used to be an incapacitation loophole where if someone basically was incapacitated, drank too much, used drugs, etc., on their own, you know, they drank too much, then if they were sexually assaulted, you know, it was like basically their fault. So similar to, it sounds like Minnesota, but thankfully Senate Bill 199 passed, which closed the incapacitation loophole. So now in North Carolina, regardless of whether or not it was a drug facilitated sexual assault because someone, you know, spiked your drink or whatever, or because you drank too much on your own, that's no longer an argument for not being able to give consent. And I'll also note, because it's another big part of the Senate Bill 199, there used to be a consent loophole as well in North Carolina, where if you started a consensual sexual act and then revoked consent, that wasn't grounds for a rape accusation or a sexual assault accusation. And that also has been closed now. So, you know, if you start having sex or start engaging in sexual activity with someone and then you revoke consent, that is also no longer a loophole to not be able to charge that person with sexual assault.
Thank you so much, Leah, for answering that question. You mentioned consent influence and how North Carolina laws now protect victims against that loophole. I did some brief research and I see that among college age women, that date rape is super prevalent. It's something as high as 68% of sexual assaults are date rape. Do you, Leah, Priyanka, or Daisy, want to jump in and give us some insight on that, on date rape? And when I say insight, I mean, sometimes the predator, and you're going on, let's just talk about, even from personal experience, you're going on a date and you're thinking, oh, everything's gonna be good. And then it ends up that you are abused and you're violated or something of that nature. In a situation like that, what would you recommend the victim do? What's the best course of action to report and seek help in that situation? And any one of our esteemed panelists can jump in on that.
Yeah, if I can, I'll just start by saying that I think generally, date rape is a term that we hear a lot, but it's actually a term we're trying to move away from because I think it carries connotations that that it's somehow less severe or like there's less of an issue with it because it's somebody that you know. And I think there is kind of this stereotypical idea of like rape is like when someone jumps out at you in the alley and like sexually assaults you and you're vulnerable, and like that's not true. Sexual assault is sexual assault regardless of who the harm doer is. I think that's definitely something just, I would love for people to kind of keep in mind when they're thinking about how they're talking about sexual assault, being mindful of the language that we use. And so
I'm going to pause right there. So would you absolutely say that again? So let's not assume anyone watching knows anything about the politically correct terms, because I came from an era, I'm of course a little older, where that term was so widely used. And you're right. I mean, it does kind of take it desensitizes you from the impact that rape is rape. So would you please lift up for our audience exactly what you said again? Just reiterate that, because that's a great point.
Yeah, thank you. I think just when we're thinking about the way that we talk about sexual assault, it's just really important to be mindful of the language we use, and that the term date rape, I think, carries certain minimizing connotations that makes it seem like it's not as scary as something else. But we know that being, like you said, Joy, being sexually assaulted or experiencing violence from someone that you know, whether it's an acquaintance, a family member, or a partner, is way more common than experiencing stranger violence. And so it's just really important. And I think, I want Priyanka and Daisy also to jump in, but I think in terms of your question of like, what would you say to a survivor who experienced sexual violence from a partner, or just kind of like what language we use. And so advocates are always taught to match the language of the person that they're talking to. So I think, and I think this is true for everybody. If someone discloses to you that they've experienced sexual assault or rape or sexual violence or harassment, you want to match the language that the survivor is using. So, because you don't want to make assumptions about how they feel or, apply language that they don't feel like they identify with. So, whenever you're talking to someone, just kind of match the language and the tone that they're using.
Awesome. Daisy, were you going to jump in?
Yeah, I am muted. Yes, Leah, thank you so much for the clarification of language and for sharing your knowledge and wisdom with us on that. I don't want to take too much space from Priyanka, as she is a college student, right? And probably is the expert in the room on this. I also wanted to add that, we do see a prevalence of interpersonal violence at the college level, and there are absolutely, reasons for that. I'm seeing Priyanka nodding. Maybe she can help us elaborate with that. And also, the college students who I see come into the center, we've actually had quite a few of them with the onset of COVID and certain centers being closed. As well, Guilford County has, I think, 4 colleges. So there's a lot of them in the area. College students might have a multitude of concerns that are all different for them, right? Like the college students I've worked with were, their utmost concern was their classes, right? Like they needed assistance navigating the academic side of survivorship, falling behind in classes or wanting to change classes, navigating that. Whereas another survivor who might also be a college student might come in and their number one concern is medical care, right? So like, even though they are college survivors and there are specific resources in a wonderful way, that can help them, everybody's still unique in what their most pressing needs are.
And Priyanka, once you chime in, we do have 2 more audience questions, so please feel free to chime in here.
Yeah, I think that was so well said, Daisy. I think college campuses are truly its own microcosm of things that are going on. And I think resources and problems that happen are so unique. And I think touching on what Leah said, I think something that's really important for people to know, especially people in college, is that even if it is someone you're in a relationship with, it's still assault and it doesn't make it any less. And I think that's something we talk a lot about healthy relationships in the work that we do on our campus. And I think it's something that's really important because I think a lot of college students sometimes are in situations where they don't even know that this situation is unhealthy or abusive. And I think it's really important that, we start these conversations to let people know what a healthy relationship looks like, what, being in a healthy situation looks like, things like that.
And I do know that there's a cycle of abuse. And so you lifting that up, Priyanka, really, really is awesome. And I want to make sure that the people listening in really got that, that there is a cycle of abuse and need to know what abuse looks like, non-consent. Could you all give us, before we go into our next question, just what is sexual assault? Could you define that for our audience? I never like to assume that because we're so close to a topic that there are a lot of misnomers about sexual assault. And one of them is that sexual assault only impacts women, and that's a misconception as well. So would you all quickly, just in like a round robin, and Priyanka, I'll start with you, would you just kind of define sexual assault for our audience?
Yeah, I think maybe Leah or Daisy could provide a more articulate definition, but I'll say, I think I'll say, I think any incident in which anything is happening, you're being touched or anything like that is happening without your consent. So whether that's verbal or nonverbal, you are being, anything that's happening to you without your consent.
Right. Awesome, thank you. And I'm gonna ask Leah to jump in next. Would you define sexual assault in your words, please?
Yeah, so sexual violence is any unwanted sexual contact that happens without free and clear consent. And I also want to touch on your point, Joy, of course, that it's really important to acknowledge that sexual violence can happen to anybody. It is not something that only happens to women. So I do just want to lift up that more than half, 51.1% of female victims of rape reported being raped by an intimate partner and 40.8% by an acquaintance. And then for men, for male victims, more than 52.4% reported being raped by an acquaintance and 15.1% by a stranger. And so it's really important to remember that, regardless of race, gender, sexuality, class, or ability, anyone can experience sexual violence. And we know that people with marginalized identities, such as women of color, people with disabilities, and trans women are actually the most vulnerable to experiencing sexual violence.
Awesome. And Daisy, would you chime in and give us a few words on your definition of sexual violence?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first 2 people said just about all I would say. I tend to be more brief in my definition, but I also am not super involved with legal proceedings with this. So when clients come in, you know, if it's sexualized violence, then that's, you know, why we're meeting. But I understand that there are, you know, broader definitions for important reasons. And I would love to echo Leah's point that marginalized communities experience sexualized violence at higher rates, particularly, you know, queer communities. And it's a huge topic to get into, but I definitely want to help us break the myth that this just happens between, you know, men and women. It happens for all types of folks, you know, unfortunately, but it's good for us to be aware of.
That's an awesome point, and thank you for lifting that up. And now I'm going to pass it over to Ava. Would you give us our next question, please?
Yes, definitely. The next question is, would you say that the amount of sexual assault that occurs has increased or decreased overall since the beginning of the pandemic?
I know you all touched on this during your talk, but would anyone like to reiterate quickly their findings on that question? Daisy?
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's hard to say definitively, right? Like, and we are still in the pandemic, so there's some aspects of that question that are hard to contain. But I would definitely say, you know, we're still seeing clients, even though there's a risk of contracting COVID by coming into the office, and we see a lot of clients. So if that's any measure, you know, people are taking the risk to come in here.
Awesome. Thank you so very much. And Ava, our last question, please. Uh-oh, you're on mute, Ava.
Yes, the last question is, at what age do you first talk to your kids about assault?
Now
Such a great question.
Leah, would you like to hop in on that one?
Yeah, so I think it's less about at what age do you start talking to your kids about sexual assault, and more about at what age do you start talking to your kids about like consent and bodily autonomy. So you can start talking to your kids as infants about bodily autonomy, right? And letting your child know, like I know our executive director, Monica Johnson Hostler, talks about when she was raising her daughter, like even from an infant, she would kind of, when she was going to pick her baby up, she would say like, okay, I'm going to pick you up now. So kind of just like from the really early stages, introducing this idea of like physical touch. And so I think from an early age, you can start talking about, you know, like talking with your kids about what is consent. So it's asking for permission before someone touches you. And it's about, you know, you can say things like, you know, is it okay if I touch you here? Does that feel okay? You know, if you're going to grab their hand or you're going to touch their face, you know, things like that. So I think that can start at a really early age. And so Priyanka and Daisy may have more thoughts about this as well, but I know that there are a lot of local rape crisis centers that do work in their school systems, where they go in and they talk to the young people about things like consent and healthy relationships. And they start from elementary school and go up through high school, and the curriculum kind of changes over time.
Awesome, awesome, awesome. That is powerful. We are coming down to our last few minutes in this power hour. Such a rich conversation, a necessary conversation that has started today, but will definitely continue throughout the month. Join us on April 22nd at 12 p.m., same place, WomenNC's Facebook, for our next Lunch and Learn, all about human trafficking. On behalf of WomenNC and NCCASA, my name is Joy Cook, board member of WomenNC, and I want to thank each and every one of our panelists, Leah, Daisy, Priyanka, for joining us. I also want to thank our board chair and executive director, Ava, Morgan, Alexandra, and anyone else who made it possible for this event to take place. If you do need any help, any resources. We're going to quickly go around. If you, starting with Priyanka, then go into Leah, and then Leah, and then Daisy will close us out. Please give those resources again if you or someone you know needs help and resources with sexual violence. Priyanka?
Yeah, so a lot of the resources that I can talk about are specific to NC State's campus, but I'm sure a lot of other college campuses across North Carolina have similar resources. So I'll just say the name of the website that has all the other resources listed under it. So it's go.ncsu.edu/support survivors. So it has a lot of really great information about women's center advocates, counseling center services, Title IX offices, all of that really good stuff. And then also the helpline number is on there, which is a 24/7 sexual assault helpline that you can call at any time or email as well if you're a student.
Awesome, awesome, awesome. And next to you, Leah.
Yeah, so if you are seeking support, we encourage you to find your local rape crisis center. And so you can do that by going to nccasa.org and clicking on the Get Help link. And then you can type in your county and it will let you know which rape crisis center represents your county that you can go and seek help at. You can also call 1-800-656-4673. That's the National Sexual Assault Hotline, and it's available 24 hours, and it can also connect you to local support.
Awesome. And Daisy, would you give us the contact information for you and your organization?
Yeah, yes. So for the Family Services of the Piedmont, that would be High Point and Greensboro, mainly Guilford County. Their contact is safeandhealthyfamilies.com. If you Google Family Services of the Piedmont, you will also find it. And to the point of volunteering in the community to make communities stronger, I would recommend Volunteer GSO and Volunteer of the Triad to find resources there.
Awesome. Thank you all so very much. And to be aware of future events such as this, please do join the WomenNC listserv at www.womennc.org and also NCCASA.org. And Daisy just gave the family services, as well as Priyanka gave the information for NCSU. Again, don't forget to join us on April 22nd. And thank you all so much for joining us and have a wonderful day. Were there any final words for any of our panelists or Maria? Awesome.
Not from me. Thank you, Joy. Thanks to Joy Cook. Thanks to all of you. We truly
thank you so very much. Thank you all. Have a great afternoon.
Bye.
Bye-bye.